The winter of 1781 settled over a dying war. Snow covered the camps along the Hudson, muffling the sounds of hunger and weariness. The soldiers of the Continental Army, their uniforms little more than rags, drilled out of habit rather than hope. Pay was months overdue. Supplies arrived late, if at all. The dream of liberty, that burning faith of '76, flickered low in the wind. Even Washington, whose will had carried the revolution through every failure, felt the weight of futility pressing down on his shoulders. From the frozen heights of New York, he watched the enemy thrive. The British held the coast. New York, Charleston, Savannah, a chain of ports binding the colonies tighter with each passing month. Their ships moved freely, their soldiers well fed and paid in gold. They could strike where they pleased, then vanish behind the guns of their fleet. For 5 years, Washington had fought them to a standstill, but never to victory. The war had become a slow bleed of men and morale. Each sunrise brought the same question: how much longer could they endure? In Philadelphia, Congress was broke and divided, its paper money worthless. Delegates argued over debts, foreign loans, and the weary business of keeping an army alive. Across the states, farmers cursed tax collectors, merchants smuggled goods to the enemy, and whispers spread that perhaps independence had been a mistake. The revolution had survived by faith, but faith alone could not fill a soldier's stomach or shoe his bleeding feet. Washington wrote privately, "We are at the end of our tether. I tremble for the cause we have labored to defend." And yet, somewhere beneath the fatigue, he refused to surrender to despair. He still believed the war could be won not by strength, but by patience. He placed his hope in the alliance that had begun as a desperate gamble: France. The French army under Rochambeau lay encamped at Newport, their blue coats and gold lace a flash of foreign discipline amid colonial chaos. Their navy, somewhere across the Atlantic, remained the wild card. If it could arrive at the right place, at the right time, perhaps, just perhaps, the tide could turn. But even alliances frayed under strain. The French were cautious, their commanders skeptical of American resolve. They wanted a decisive plan, not endless waiting on the Hudson. Washington wanted to strike New York, to finish the war where it had begun, but lacked the strength to do it. It was a partnership held together by diplomacy and sheer necessity. Every council of war ended the same way, with Washington staring at maps that offered no hope, only choices between bad and worse. So the revolution drifted into its 6th year, tired, broke, and directionless. The soldiers still drilled. The sentries still stood their watch. The cause still lived, but barely. No one could see that salvation was already stirring far to the south, where a British general named Cornwallis was marching toward a river town called Yorktown and toward the end of an empire. By 1781, the British Empire ruled more of the world than any kingdom in history, and was bleeding from every corner of it. From the sugar islands of the Caribbean to the coasts of India, from Ireland's restless fields to the distant colonies of America, the red flag of the empire flew over lands it could no longer fully command. What had once been triumph now felt like strain. Armies were scattered, fleets divided, and the treasury drained by a war that refused to end. Britain had conquered too much, and in doing so, had trapped itself. In London, ministers bickered while news from abroad grew worse. France and Spain had entered the war, turning what began as a colonial rebellion into a global conflict. The Royal Navy, once the envy of Europe, now fought on 3 oceans at once. West Indian sugar colonies, the jewel of British wealth, needed constant protection from French squadrons. In India, the East India Company demanded soldiers to guard its possessions. Even at home, unrest simmered in Ireland. The empire's reach had grown vast, but its grasp was faltering. Every regiment sent to one front weakened another. Into this overstretched empire marched Charles, Earl Cornwallis, tall, proud, and battle-hardened. He had fought at Princeton and Brandywine, crushed rebellion in the Carolinas, and believed the key to victory lay in the South. There, he reasoned, loyalist support was strong. The people would rally to the crown once rebel armies were destroyed. It was a sound theory and disastrously wrong. The Carolinas became his graveyard of hope. Cornwallis won battles, but never peace. At Camden, he shattered Gates's army, but found himself master of empty ground. Every mile of road was a gauntlet, every farm behind him another skirmish. Men like Francis Marion the Swamp Fox struck from the reeds and vanished into the marshes. Nathaniel Greene harassed his supply lines, refusing open battle, trading land for time. The British army advanced, but the country behind it turned hostile. Cornwallis's columns marched through ghost towns, their red coats fading beneath Carolina dust. Victory, he realized too late, meant nothing if it could not be held. By spring, the British general was chasing shadows. His troops, worn thin by heat and hunger, staggered north through the Carolinas into Virginia. He sent letters pleading for support, for ships, for clarity, but London's answers came months too late, or not at all. Each step brought him closer to the Chesapeake, where the rivers met the sea and where he hoped the Royal Navy would bring relief. Instead, he was marching into a trap of his own making, one shaped by the Empire's arrogance and stretched by its ambition. While Cornwallis trudged toward Virginia, Washington and Rochambeau watched from the Hudson, unaware that the fate of the war was moving inexorably southward. The empire that had once ruled the seas was beginning to drown in them, undone not by defeat alone, but by the slow collapse of its own reach. In America, the red tide had gone as far as it could go. When spring came to the Carolinas in 1781, the war there had already turned sour. Cornwallis, weary of chasing rebels through swamps and pine forests, convinced himself that the struggle could be ended only by striking at the source, Virginia. It was, he believed, the beating heart of the rebellion, a nest of partisans and supply depots feeding Washington's army to the north, crush Virginia, and the colonies would crumble from within. It was a bold idea, and like so many bold ideas in history, it was one step removed from disaster. He began his march north with about 7,000 men, veterans of years of hard fighting, scarred by sun and disease. They moved through a country burned by war, past abandoned farms and towns stripped bare by both armies. The Carolina campaign had broken loyalist morale. Those who had once welcomed British troops now turned their backs. The redcoats advanced, but behind them lay nothing but ash and silence. Still, Cornwallis pressed on, convinced that Virginia would be different, richer, more loyal, more decisive. It was the gambler's faith that the next throw would redeem all losses. At first, fortune seemed to favor him. His forces scattered local militia, captured Richmond, and sent Thomas Jefferson, the state's governor, fleeing on horseback into the hills. The rebels appeared once again to be on the run. Cornwallis reported confidently to London that he had broken the back of resistance in the south. But the resistance was only changing shape. The Marquis de Lafayette, commanding a small Continental detachment, shadowed his movements skillfully, refusing battle, cutting off scouts, striking at isolated detachments. Every advance brought Cornwallis deeper into a landscape he did not understand, against an enemy that refused to stand still. The Virginia summer closed around him like a snare. His men suffered from heat, disease, and endless marches through dust and swamp. Supplies dwindled, and promised reinforcements never came. Still, Cornwallis remained certain that once he reached the Chesapeake Bay, the Royal Navy would resupply and secure him. The sea, Britain's eternal refuge, would not fail him now. He chose Yorktown, a small port on the York River, as his base, fortified it with earthworks, and waited for his fleet. To his eyes, it was a defensible position, a safe harbour. In truth, it was a cage. Even as he dug in, the balance of the war was shifting beyond his sight. Washington's army, long pinned before New York, would soon be on the move. The French fleet was sailing for the Chesapeake. Fate and poor coordination had placed Cornwallis precisely where his enemies wanted him. What he saw as a southern triumph was, in reality, the Empire's final mistake. Yorktown would not be the end of rebellion. It would be the end of British rule in America. In the spring of 1781, George Washington looked down from the hills above the Hudson and saw a war that refused to move. Before him lay New York, still held by British troops behind walls and ships and guns. For 6 years he had dreamed of retaking it, the city where the war had begun, the prize that had slipped through his fingers in 76. Yet every plan to strike ended the same way, with too few men, too little powder, and no navy to challenge the British fleet. The revolution had not failed, but it no longer seemed to be winning. Washington's army was a shadow of its former self. Regiments existed on paper, but not in the field. Many soldiers had gone home after their enlistments expired, leaving behind only the veterans who had nowhere else to go. They were half-starved, half-paid, and wholly weary. Rumors of mutiny spread through the camps, not from disloyalty, but from despair. Men who had crossed icy rivers and fought in rags now wondered if their sacrifice had been in vain. "We fight, we bleed, and yet we starve," one soldier wrote. Washington could inspire them, but even faith has limits. He faced enemies not only across the river, but in Philadelphia. Congress was broke, its authority questioned by the very states it claimed to lead. Promised supplies never arrived, and letters from Washington went unanswered for weeks. He had learned to command without resources, to build discipline out of hunger, and to win loyalty with patience alone. Yet even his endurance was beginning to fray. His officers saw it in the long silences at his desk, the moments when his gaze lingered on maps as though searching for a future he no longer believed in. Then there were the Allies, the French. Rochambeau and his disciplined regiments had arrived the year before, camped in Rhode Island, glittering in powder and lace. They were professionals, patient and proud, but they took orders from Paris, not from him. Every strategy was a negotiation, every march a test of trust. Washington needed them desperately, their ships, their gold, their guns, yet he could not command them. At councils of war, he masked his frustration behind courtesy, but the truth gnawed at him. America's independence rested on foreign will. Still, beneath the doubt, the old fire remained. Washington believed that one decisive victory could redeem everything: the years of struggle, the blood and hunger, the faith of a nation balanced on the edge of collapse. But where could that victory be won? New York was too strong. The South was too distant. He paced the floor of his headquarters, hands clasped behind his back as rain battered the windows. Outside, the soldiers drilled in mud, unaware that their commander's thoughts were turning south toward a river town in Virginia, and a chance, at last, to end the war. When the French army landed on American soil in 1780, it was greeted with cheers, bells, and prayers, but also with the quiet desperation of a people running out of hope. The revolution had survived only through endurance. Victory seemed a memory. Now, on the shores of Newport, Rhode Island, ships flying the white flag of Bourbon France rode at anchor, their decks bristling with cannon, their holds heavy with gold, powder, and discipline. It was the alliance Washington had long prayed for, yet alliances, he knew, were as fragile as faith. Jean-Baptiste Donatien de Vimeur, Comte de Rochambeau, was no revolutionary. He was a soldier of monarchy, calm, methodical, and steeped in the etiquette of Versailles. His troops marched in perfect step, their uniforms spotless even in the mud of America. To them, this was not a crusade for liberty, but a campaign in a wider war against Britain, one front among many. They admired Washington's courage but doubted his army's endurance. His men were thin, ragged, and poorly supplied. To the French officers who had fought on the fields of Europe, it looked less like an army and more like a cause kept alive by sheer stubbornness. For Washington, the arrival of these allies brought both salvation and strain. He understood the stakes. The French were the only power capable of breaking Britain's grip on the seas. Without them, there could be no final victory. But he also understood the danger of pride. France was sending aid to a republic born from rebellion. Its officers deferred to him in ceremony but questioned him in private. They wanted assurance that the Americans would fight, that this was not a lost cause wrapped in noble speeches. Their meetings were cautious dances of diplomacy. Rochambeau pressed for patience, for careful coordination with the fleet still in the Caribbean. Washington pressed for action, urging a joint assault on New York. Between them lay mutual respect, but also mutual uncertainty. Washington had never commanded Europeans. Rochambeau had never fought a war without kings. In candlelit councils, they debated maps by the hour, the Frenchman's polished calm set against the Virginian's quiet intensity. Slowly, grudgingly, trust began to take root. When Rochambeau's couriers brought word that Admiral de Grasse might sail north with a powerful fleet, something shifted. Washington's eyes brightened for the first time in months. "If we can command the sea," he said, "we shall command the end of the war." Rochambeau nodded, though cautiously. The alliance was tested daily by hunger, by miscommunication, by pride. But it held. In the mud and misery of the Hudson camps, French and American soldiers began to drill side by side, trading laughter and tobacco across the lines. The Americans admired the French discipline. The French marveled at the Americans' stubborn defiance. Two nations, bound by need and principle, were learning to fight as one, and as Washington stood watching them in the dusk light, he knew the revolution's fate now depended on keeping that fragile unity alive long enough to strike a single, decisive blow. In the summer heat of 1781, New York City glimmered like a trap, outwardly calm, inwardly crawling with spies. Redcoats patrolled the streets, British officers dined in taverns heavy with smoke, and merchants whispered in back rooms where loyalty could shift with the price of sugar. Beneath that surface ran a shadow war letters written in invisible ink, messages buried in laundry lines, secrets carried in the hems of women's skirts. It was here, in the occupied heart of the colonies, that Washington's unseen army, the Culper Ring, worked in silence. They were ordinary men and women, shopkeepers, sailors, farmers, but their trade was deception. Abraham Woodhull in Setauket, Anna Strong with her coded signals, Robert Townsend posing as a loyalist journalist. Their reports passed from hand to hand, across bays and rivers, until they reached the Commander-in-Chief's desk at New Windsor. Washington had built his intelligence network out of necessity. His army was weak. Information was his only weapon. Every scrap of news from New York might mean the difference between victory and ruin. That summer, a report arrived written in careful cipher and marked with Washington's personal code number for Townsend 723. It spoke of movement in the British High Command, of orders shifting troops from the Carolinas toward Virginia. Cornwallis, it said, was marching north, establishing a base on the Chesapeake at a place called Yorktown. At first, it seemed another rumor in a war full of them. But as more messages arrived from merchants, deserters, intercepted couriers, the pattern became clear. The British were consolidating in Virginia. They thought it safe. Washington read the dispatch in silence, his hands clasped behind his back, pacing as he always did when his mind caught fire. Yorktown, deep south, open to the sea, reachable only if the French fleet controlled the bay. It was an opportunity, but also a gamble beyond reason. Still, he felt the familiar spark, the sense that fortune, long his enemy, might finally be turning. He ordered more intelligence. He demanded confirmation. When the next cipher came, it carried the same message: Cornwallis, entrenched at York. In secret correspondence, Washington began to lay his own deception. To the British in New York, he sent every signal that he still planned to attack Manhattan troop movements, fake camps, even letters designed to be intercepted. Meanwhile, he quietly prepared to march south. Only Rochambeau and a handful of aides knew the truth. The spies who had risked their lives in New York had given him the key. The Culper Ring vanished back into the city's shadows, their work done. None of them would see the siege that their information made possible, yet Washington never forgot them. "There are men," he wrote later, "who serve their country in silence and deserve its thanks more than those who win its battles." The guns of Yorktown were still months away, but the victory had already begun, written in invisible ink. 1781, in a dim tent lit by a single tallow candle. Washington and Rochambeau spread a map across a rough table and began to imagine an impossibility. The British watched New York with a fleet and a garrison. Any move against Manhattan would run headlong into ships and guns. Yet the map showed another seam. Virginia's rivers and creeks, a place where an army could be trapped by sea if the French fleet held the bay. The idea was audacious: pretend to threaten New York, then vanish and strike at Cornwallis in the south. But audacity had been his clearest ally. They called it deception not because it was false, but because it would have to look like something it was not. Washington ordered demonstrative troop concentrations and noisy preparations in the Hudson Valley campfires stacked where none were needed, drums that beat a little louder, letters angled to be intercepted. Couriers rode ostentatiously past British pickets. Every visible movement pointed to a New York attack. The goal was to freeze the British gaze northward, while the real army picked its way south. Rochambeau, always the cautious professional, listened to the plan with the reserve of a man who measured risk in maps and marches. He worried about supply, about marching his polished regiments 400 miles across narrow roads, and about trusting a French fleet to appear where it was promised. But he also recognized the moral force behind Washington's patience. This was a chance to make coordination count, to turn Allied strength into a single, decisive stroke rather than 1,000 wasted skirmishes. In the end, discipline won over doubt. The scheme required timing the land march to the tide of the sea. Washington's staff opened a private channel to Admiral de Grasse, begging him to bring his fleet into the Chesapeake rather than return to the Caribbean. If de Grasse could command the bay, Cornwallis would be cut off. If not, the march would be suicide. When news finally came, the French fleet would sail north. The decision hardened. What had been a risky feint became a coordinated gamble with a real chance of closure. Logistics were the secret heart of the deception. Wagons were loaded with conspicuous supplies and then driven ostentatiously in circles. Baggage trains were sent on false routes. Engineers dug practice works that would be seen by enemy scouts. Meanwhile, detachments slipped away at dawn, small at first, then in organized columns that melted into the countryside. The march read like a magician's sleight of hand. Attention where you wanted it, movement where you needed it. When the Allied armies finally broke camp and turned south, they did so with a silence that belied the noise they had made for weeks. Continental and French soldiers marched shoulder to shoulder, civilians lining the roads to cheer and supply fresh bread, and a conspiracy of signals kept the secret between a handful of commanders. The deception had worked. New York stayed wary, Cornwallis settled into Yorktown, and history, for the first time in years, seemed to have given Washington a real opening. The march began in silence beneath a rising August sun, the air thick with heat and dust. Drums beat low along the Hudson as Washington's army broke camp, their worn boots striking the road that led south 400 miles to destiny. For years, they had fought and starved in the shadow of defeat, but this was different. They were moving not to survive, but to finish. Columns of French blue and American brown stretched for miles, banners rippling, muskets glinting like mirrors in the light. Hope, long buried under hunger and despair, began to breathe again. Through New Jersey and Pennsylvania they marched, two nations made one by exhaustion and purpose. The French moved with clockwork precision, drums crisp, uniforms immaculate, while the Continentals trudged beside them in patched coats and bare feet. Yet there was no envy, no resentment. Villagers poured into the streets to cheer. Women waved from porches. Children ran alongside offering water and bread. In towns where war had once brought only fear, the sight of this great Allied host brought something new belief. The revolution, thought dead, was moving again. Washington rode at the head of his troops, his face calm but his thoughts racing. Every mile carried risk, discovery, delay, failure. If the British realized the deception, the army could be trapped between New York and Virginia. But if the French fleet truly reached the Chesapeake in time, if the gods of wind and war finally favored them, then all the suffering of 6 years might yet find its meaning. "We are now in motion," he wrote to a friend, "and Providence must decide the rest." In Philadelphia, the soldiers marched through streets, draped in flags, greeted by the tolling of church bells and the thunder of cannon salutes. Congress, for once united, stood at the windows to watch. The city had seen Washington before, but never like this, not as the weary commander holding the line, but as the general of an army reborn. The cheers followed the troops out of the city and down the long road south, fading into the summer haze. The march tested endurance as much as resolve. Roads turned to mud after sudden rains, wagons broke, horses died in harness. The men marched 20 miles a day under a merciless sun, sleeping in fields and barns, waking to the sound of fifes and the creak of wheels. Yet the rhythm itself became a kind of prayer, step by step, closer to the end. Washington's soldiers no longer asked if the war would end, but where. They did not yet know the name Yorktown, but they would soon write it into eternity. By late September, the dust of the northern roads lay far behind them. The blue of France and the brown of America had become one color, the color of resolve. As they neared Virginia, the air carried the smell of salt and gunpowder. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Cornwallis waited behind his redoubts. And somewhere farther still, the sails of de Grasse's fleet caught the wind. The march was ending, but the destiny it carried was just about to begin. In the humid air of late summer, the small Virginia port of Yorktown buzzed with the noise of shovels and hammers. British soldiers dug trenches, built redoubts, and raised earthworks under the orders of their commander, Charles, Earl Cornwallis. His men had marched hard through the Carolinas and into Virginia, weary but seasoned, and now they worked the soft Virginia soil into a fortress. Behind them, the York River shimmered, a promise of safety. With the Royal Navy at his back, Cornwallis believed he was untouchable. Yorktown, he thought, was perfect ground. The river protected one flank, the town another. Supply ships could reach him from New York within days. If the rebels dared approach, British ships would sweep the bay clear and deliver him reinforcements. It was the logic of empire. The sea had always been Britain's shield and sword. He wrote confidently to his superiors that his position was secure, that he would hold Virginia as the cornerstone of royal power in the South. But confidence, in war, is often a mirage that fades with the tide. Far from his lines, fate was shifting at sea. From the Caribbean, the sails of the French fleet rose over the horizon 28 ships of the line under Admiral de Grasse, each bristling with guns and carrying soldiers eager for revenge. They had slipped the British net and were racing north to the Chesapeake. Washington and Rochambeau's gamble had found its answer. Cornwallis's lifeline, the Royal Navy, was about to be cut. In New York, British Commander Sir Henry Clinton received fragments of reports, rumors of French fleets, whispers of American movements. He assumed Washington still lingered before Manhattan. His own scouts confirmed campfires along the Hudson and wagon trains that seemed to circle aimlessly. Deception had done its work. By the time Clinton realized the truth, the Allied armies were already halfway to Virginia, and de Grasse's warships were closing the mouth of the bay. Inside Yorktown, Cornwallis's world shrank. The humid air grew thick with mosquitoes and doubt. Civilians fled as his engineers labored day and night, strengthening redoubts, mounting cannon, digging deep against the coming siege. Yet each hammer blow built not only defences, but the walls of his own confinement. When a lookout reported sails on the horizon, Cornwallis smiled, certain it was the Royal Navy come to relieve him. But as the ships drew closer, the flags were wrong. Blue, not red, fluttered in the wind. The fleur-de-lis, not the Union Jack. For the first time in the war, the Atlantic favoured the rebellion. The French fleet sealed the Chesapeake like a locked gate, and Cornwallis, soldier of empire, confident in the ocean's loyalty, found himself landbound, trapped between the river behind and the armies marching toward him. The sound of hammers still echoed through Yorktown, but now each strike seemed to mark not construction, but entombment. The trap had closed, and the hunter had become the prey. On the morning of September 5th, 1781, the calm waters of the Chesapeake exploded into thunder. Admiral François de Grasse, commanding the French fleet, had just sighted the white sails of the Royal Navy cresting the horizon, the last hope of rescue for Cornwallis at Yorktown. The French guns swung outboard, matches lit, decks cleared for battle. Within minutes, the quiet tide was consumed by smoke and iron. It would be the only major fleet action of the American Revolution, and its outcome would decide the war. The British squadron under Admiral Thomas Graves approached with the precision of habit, 30 ships of the line in gleaming order. Their plan was simple: fight through the French, open the bay, and relieve Cornwallis. But the winds betrayed them. De Grasse had anchored his ships in a crescent that caught the breeze first, his sails taut, his lines steady. As the British closed, the French guns roared. Cannonballs shrieked across the water, smashing masts, splintering decks, and sending sprays of seawater and blood skyward. It was not a swift battle, but a grinding, punishing exchange, 5 hours of thunder, smoke, and chaos. The ships drifted so close that gun crews could see one another through the haze, firing until their decks ran slick. The French fought with the memory of earlier defeats in their hearts, determined to prove that the sea no longer belonged to Britain alone. De Grasse moved his flagship, the Ville de Paris, through the centre of the line, his flags snapping in defiance, shouting orders above the roar of broadsides. When dusk fell, both fleets were battered, but the French still held the mouth of the bay. Graves, unsure of de Grasse's strength, and with half his ships crippled, pulled back to regroup. The next morning, he found the wind had turned against him, and the French had reinforced their position. The Royal Navy, for once, yielded the sea. Cornwallis's salvation had arrived, looked upon the French blockade, and then turned away. He would not know it yet, but his fate had just been sealed hundreds of miles from his command. De Grasse's victory was not just tactical, it was existential. For the first time in the war, the British Army in America was cut off by sea. No supply, no escape, no reinforcements. The French sailors, exhausted and exultant, patched their ships as cheers echoed across the decks. Word spread like wildfire through the Allied camps marching south. The bay is ours. Washington, upon hearing the news, allowed himself a rare moment of triumph. The world, he said quietly, may yet be free. As the cannon smoke drifted away and the sea fell calm once more, the truth became clear. Empires rise and fall on winds and waves, and on that September day, the winds had chosen liberty. Cornwallis still held his fort, but the ocean that had carried Britain's power for a century had turned against her. The last gate of the war was closed, and the hourglass had begun to run out. When Washington's army crested the final ridge and saw the waters of the York River glinting below, the war that had wandered for 6 long years suddenly had a destination. Yorktown lay before them, a patchwork of earthworks and redoubts, a town transformed into a fortress. To the north, the French banners of Rochambeau snapped in the wind. To the south, blue-coated Continentals moved with practiced purpose. After years of separate campaigns, defeat, retreat, and waiting, the Revolution's armies had finally come together, one army, one cause, one chance. Washington rode among the ranks in silence, his face impassive, but his officers could see the light in his eyes. He had dreamed of this moment since '76, a full army before him, a foreign ally at his side, and an enemy cornered. "At last," he murmured to Lafayette, "we have them where we want them." Orders flew. Engineers marked positions, surveyors staked the first parallels, and soldiers began to dig. The noose was beginning to tighten. The work was relentless. In the humid Virginia air, thousands of men swung shovels by day and pickaxes by night. Dirt and sweat mixed until the soldiers were indistinguishable. French grenadiers beside American militiamen, black soldiers beside white, all carving trenches that crept closer to Cornwallis's lines. Artillerymen hauled heavy guns through the mud, positioning them in batteries that overlooked the town. The sound of hammers, spades, and wagons filled the night, the quiet symphony of a siege being born. Cornwallis watched from his parapet, unnerved by the scale of what was unfolding. Every sunrise revealed new lines, new guns, new banners. What he had dismissed as a ragged army of rebels had become something formidable, precise, organized, and growing by the hour. He wrote to Clinton in New York, pleading for help, promising he could hold out a few weeks at most. Each courier that left Yorktown rode straight into the French blockade. None returned. By early October, the Allies had surrounded the town completely. Washington commanded the American right, Rochambeau the French left, and between them a crescent of cannon and trenches tightened around the British like a closing fist. At night, the armies could hear each other through the darkness, the whinny of horses, the clank of spades, the distant roll of drums. Both sides knew what was coming. Yorktown had become a trap, and the British were the ones inside it. For Washington, the sight was both vindication and burden. He knew that every life now lost would mark the price of freedom. Yet for the first time, he saw victory not as a dream, but as an approaching reality. "We fight together now," he told Rochambeau, looking across the Allied lines where blue and brown uniforms mixed in the twilight. "And when we strike, it will be as one." The guns were ready. The noose had closed. Yorktown waited. On the night of October 9th, 1781, Washington stepped into a newly finished trench and raised a torch. The signal flared against the sky, and a moment later the world erupted. From one end of the Allied line to the other, more than 100 cannon thundered in unison. The ground shook, the air filled with the whine of iron and the crash of shells bursting over Yorktown. After years of retreat and endurance, the Continental Army was finally on the attack. The siege had begun in earnest. The British guns answered, but their fire was thin and scattered. The French and American batteries, perfectly sighted and disciplined, poured round after round into the enemy lines. The roar never stopped. Day blurred into night, night into day, until time itself seemed to vanish beneath the steady heartbeat of artillery. The sky glowed red over the bay, the town beneath it a storm of flame and dust. Houses splintered, redoubts collapsed, and even the river seemed to tremble beneath the weight of the bombardment. Washington stood in the trenches, his cloak drawn tight against the acrid wind, watching the shot fall with grim satisfaction. For 6 years he had watched British guns pound his cities, Boston, New York, Philadelphia. Now the sound was his. "Fire low," he reminded the gunners, and with purpose. His orders carried down the line. The artillerymen cheered and worked on, their faces blackened by powder, their arms blistered from heat. Lafayette, watching the enemy's fortifications crumble, turned to Rochambeau and said quietly, "They cannot stand much longer." Inside Yorktown, chaos reigned. Redcoats huddled in bomb-proof shelters as cannonballs crashed through roofs and walls. Horses screamed in the streets. Barrels of gunpowder exploded in sudden firestorms. Cornwallis moved between shattered positions, encouraging his men with words that sounded hollow against the endless roar. "We will hold," he told them, though even he could see the truth. His once proud garrison was being buried alive. The sea that had promised rescue now held only French ships. The land that offered safety now rained death. Every night, the Allied trenches crept closer. Sappers tunneled forward under fire, digging new parallels within musket range of the British lines. Cannon were dragged into position by hand, inch by inch, until their muzzles stared directly into Yorktown's heart. When a French mortar shell struck a British ammunition depot, the explosion lit the night like sunrise. The soldiers in the trenches cheered. Washington, standing nearby, removed his hat and bowed his head. "The work advances," he said simply. By mid-October, the town was unrecognizable, a wasteland of smoke and ruin. Cornwallis's defences sagged, his men exhausted, his supplies dwindling. The British flag still flew over Yorktown, but beneath it there was no hope left, only endurance. And yet, even in the thunder, Washington's patience held. He knew the siege was not finished, not until the final redoubts fell, and the last gateway to British escape was sealed forever. On the evening of October 14th, 1781, the guns fell silent for the first time in days. Smoke drifted low over the trenches, mingling with mist from the river. The sudden quiet was unnerving, too still, too heavy, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Then, as the moon rose behind thin clouds, men began to gather in the shadows. Bayonets were fixed. Flintlocks were unloaded. There would be no warning shots tonight. Washington's final order passed down the line. The outer British defences, redoubts 9 and 10, must fall. Redoubt 10 faced the American sector. Alexander Hamilton, young, restless, and burning for glory, had lobbied for the honour of leading the assault. Washington, who had once chastised him for impatience, now trusted him with the key attack. "You will have your chance," he told him. The French, under the gallant Baron de Viomenil and the Duc de Lauzun, would strike Redoubt 9 on the left. The assaults would be simultaneous, 2 blades thrust in the dark, meant to cut the final threads of British defence. Just after 8 o'clock, the signal cannon fired. Hamilton leapt from the trench, sword drawn, shouting for his men to follow. Hundreds of Continentals surged forward in silence, their bayonets glinting under the moon. The British sentries barely had time to shout before the Americans were upon them. Ladders slammed against the walls, men clawed up the parapets, hacking and stabbing in close quarters. Hamilton himself was among the first over the top, shouting, "Rush on, boys, the fort is ours." To the left, the French attacked with equal ferocity. Their drums beat a single, steady rhythm as they advanced through smoke and grapeshot. Viomenil's grenadiers charged into Redoubt 9, muskets flashing, their shouts in French and English blending into the chaos. Lauzun's men stormed the rear and drove the defenders back step by step. In less than half an hour, both redoubts were taken. The night air filled with the cries of the wounded and the wild cheers of victory. Washington watched from an advanced position, his telescope steady despite the cannon fire around him. When he saw the American flag rise over Redoubt 10, he turned to Rochambeau and simply said, "The work is done." Around them, the Allied trenches erupted in celebration. Men who had not eaten in days embraced one another, laughing through tears and gun smoke. The British line, once impregnable, had been broken by courage and bayonets in the dark. By dawn, the redoubts had been joined to the Allied trenches, their captured guns turned inward toward Yorktown. Cornwallis now stood encircled, every avenue of escape sealed. Inside his battered town, his soldiers stared toward the captured positions in disbelief. The enemy had come through the night itself. The silence that followed was not peace, but the heavy calm before surrender. The moonlight raid had ended the fighting and the empire that began it. By mid-October, 1781, Yorktown had become a graveyard of British pride. The Grand Army that had once marched unchallenged through the colonies now huddled in ruined streets, half-starved and sleepless, surrounded by enemies on land and sea. The thunder of Allied guns no longer startled them. It was constant, like weather, the rhythm of despair. Cornwallis, pale and drawn, walked the narrow lanes of his shrinking fortress and watched his empire bleed out by inches. The once polished redcoats were ghosts of themselves, uniforms shredded, rations gone, their faces blackened with smoke and hunger. Horses had long since been slaughtered for food. Barrels of powder ran low. The few remaining cannon crews fired sparingly, saving their last charges for an assault that would never come. The men dug trenches not to advance, but to hide. Every spade of dirt thrown up was another small act of survival, another hour stolen from defeat. Cornwallis's hopes turned to the river escape by water, the only dream left. One night he ordered boats prepared, hoping to ferry his army across to Gloucester Point and break through the French lines. The first wave pushed off under cover of darkness, oars muffled, hearts pounding. But as they reached midstream, the sky opened in a sudden, violent storm. Wind and rain tore at the boats, scattering them like leaves. The attempt dissolved into chaos. By dawn, the survivors stumbled back ashore, drenched, shivering, defeated by the very elements. Even nature, it seemed, had taken sides. Inside his headquarters, Cornwallis dictated one last message to General Clinton in New York. His words, usually sharp and confident, now trembled on the page. "I have not above 3 days' provisions. I must either be relieved or surrender." The courier who carried it slipped through the lines too late. Clinton's relief fleet would not arrive for weeks, and by then, there would be no army left to save. Across the Allied lines, Washington's men watched the British camp through spyglasses. Smoke rose from cooking fires that burned lower each day. Horses lay unburied in the fields. Occasionally, a single cannon fired, a hollow sound of defiance that convinced no one. The Americans and French could feel it, the enemy's will, crumbling like his walls. "They have ceased to fight," Lafayette wrote. "They only endure." Cornwallis knew the truth. The proud regiments that had conquered half the world were now trapped in a coastal village, their banners tattered, their empire cornered. His men were too weak to attack, too proud to surrender, too spent to hope. He stood at the window of his quarters, staring out toward the silent river, and whispered to an aide, "We are undone." Beyond the town's ruins, the Allied lines waited in patient silence. The last act of empire was about to begin. On the morning of October 17th, 1781, the thunder that had shaken Yorktown for 2 relentless weeks suddenly stopped. The guns fell silent, their echoes dying against the river. Smoke drifted over the shattered town, but no new shells came. For a long moment, the silence itself felt like another kind of weapon, heavy, expectant, unbearable. Then, from the British lines, a single drum began to beat, slow, measured, and over the parapet, a strip of white cloth rose into the wind. In the Allied trenches, soldiers froze, mid-motion hands still on cannon lanyards, shovels halfway through the dirt. They stared across the no-man's land where moments before men had died by the dozens. Then the cry spread down the line. "A flag! A flag!" Washington, summoned from his command post, raised his glass and saw it for himself. The white flag fluttered in the breeze over Redoubt 10, the universal plea of the beaten. Cornwallis had yielded. An officer emerged from the British works, mounted and solemn, carrying a message under a folded handkerchief. He rode slowly through the silence, past the staring faces of men who had come to destroy him, toward a French outpost that waited to receive him. The letter he carried was brief, a request for a ceasefire and terms of surrender. Washington read it without expression, then handed it to Rochambeau. "It is well," he said quietly. "Let the negotiations begin." That afternoon, under a sagging white tent pitched between the lines, officers from 3 nations faced one another across a rough wooden table. On one side sat the British representatives, grim, mud-stained, hollow-eyed. On the other, the Americans and French, their uniforms caked with dust but their bearing unbroken. The smell of gunpowder still hung in the air. Every man in that tent knew what the moment meant. Not just the end of a siege, but the end of an empire's hold on a continent. Washington did not attend the first meeting. He preferred to remain apart, above the bargaining. To him, this was not about humiliation or triumph, but justice fulfilled. The fighting had taken enough. There would be no gloating now. His orders were clear. Honourable terms for a beaten foe, nothing more, nothing less. Outside, soldiers from both armies watched the tent from afar, whispering, waiting. For 6 years they had fought toward this silence, and now it lay before them like a dream too fragile to touch. As dusk fell, the envoys stepped from the tent. The white flag still rippled above the British rampart, now tinged gold by the dying Sunday. A ceasefire had been agreed. Cornwallis would surrender his army within 2 days. The word passed through the Allied lines like a current murmurs, turning to cheers, cheers to songs, songs to tears. The war was not yet formally over, but for those who had lived it, this was the sound of peace being born. October 19th, 1781, a clear Virginia morning, cool and still after weeks of thunder. Along a dirt road between the British and Allied lines, thousands of soldiers gathered in silence, watching history take form. The redcoats, once the terror of 2 continents, marched in perfect order one last time. Their fifes and drums played not triumphal marches, but a bitter tune from the old country, the world turned upside down. At the head of the defeated column rode General Charles O'Hara, Cornwallis's second-in-command. The Earl himself had pled illness and remained in his quarters too proud, some said, to face the man who had beaten him. O'Hara carried Cornwallis's sword, its steel glinting in the sun as he approached the American line. There stood Washington, flanked by Rochambeau and Lafayette, his uniform immaculate, his expression grave. Yet when O'Hara halted before him and bowed, Washington shook his head. "Your sword, sir," he said evenly, "must be delivered to General Lincoln." It was not vengeance, but justice. Benjamin Lincoln had been forced to surrender to the British at Charleston the year before, compelled to hand over his sword to a lesser officer. Washington now gave him the dignity he had been denied. Lincoln stepped forward, received O'Hara's blade, then immediately returned it, a gesture that ended the ceremony with grace rather than humiliation. Around them, the two armies watched in a silence so deep it seemed to swallow the sound of the fifes. Then came the long, dreadful ritual. The British infantry filed past in endless ranks, their faces expressionless, their eyes fixed on the ground. One by one, they stacked their muskets, piled their flags, and laid down the weapons that had enforced an empire. American and French soldiers stood in silence, no jeers, no cheers, only the rustle of cloth and the clatter of steel. The war that had begun with a skirmish on Lexington Green now ended here, on a quiet Virginia field. Washington watched it all from horseback, motionless. He had lost more battles than he had won, buried friends, endured hunger, and seen the revolution hang by a thread. Now, in this moment of triumph, he felt no elation, only relief, and a solemn awe. "Let us be grateful," he said softly to an aide, "and humble." Behind him, the French flags dipped in salute, and the Allied cannon thundered a final salute to victory. As the last British regiment marched away, the tune faded into silence. The soldiers of the Revolution stood in the field they had fought 6 years to reach barefoot men beside polished officers, black soldiers beside white, farmers beside nobles. The world had indeed turned upside down. Across the ocean, kings would read the news and feel the earth shift beneath their thrones. But here, beneath the pale Virginia sun, one man simply bowed his head and whispered a prayer of thanks. The war for independence was over. When word of Yorktown crossed the Atlantic, it arrived like a cannon shot in the heart of empire. The news reached London on a grey November morning, carried by a courier pale with exhaustion. In the coffee houses of Westminster and the corridors of Whitehall, whispers became shouts, and disbelief hardened into silence. Cornwallis has surrendered. For a moment, no one spoke. The empire that had ruled the seas, crushed revolts, and bent continents to its will had lost not a battle, but a war. The shock rippled outward. Ministers argued in hushed voices, papers trembled in their hands. Lord North, the Prime Minister who had waged the conflict for nearly 8 years, read the dispatch once, twice, and then sank back in his chair. "Oh God," he murmured, "it is all over." He was not wrong. The British Army still held New York, Charleston, and Savannah, but the will that sustained them had collapsed. The treasury bled silver. The people groaned under taxes and grief. The dream of restoring the colonies to obedience had died in the mud of Virginia. In Parliament, the opposition seized its moment. Whig orators thundered against the folly of a war that had drained Britain's wealth and honour. "You have lost not a province," one declared, "but an entire world." Even the king, stubborn and proud, felt the tide turn against him. George III wrote privately that he would sooner abdicate than recognize American independence, yet, as the weeks passed, even his resolve began to fray. The war had become not just unpopular, but impossible. Across the Atlantic, the victors waited in wary hope. Washington kept his army encamped, unwilling to trust the British word until peace was written in ink, not rumour. "We have won the ground," he told his officers, but we must yet secure the nation. Congress moved cautiously, sending envoys to Europe. In Paris, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay began the delicate work of negotiation, a war of words, after a war of cannon. The world watched to see if this rebellion would truly become a country. By spring of 1782, the British government had fallen. North resigned, the king's ministers replaced by men who sought an end, not a victory. The Royal Navy still prowled the seas, but its sails hung like tired wings. Peace talks began in earnest, each side testing the limits of concession. Behind the formal language lay a single truth. Britain no longer had the heart to continue. The empire had survived defeats before in Europe, in Asia, but Yorktown was different. It had not been lost to kings or generals, but to farmers, merchants, and craftsmen who refused to yield. An empire built on command had been broken by conviction. When the bells of London tolled to announce the negotiations, they sounded not just for the end of a war, but for the end of an age. Britain would remain an empire, but never again the one it had been. The guns of Yorktown had gone silent, but their echoes carried far beyond Virginia. In the spring of 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, and the war that began on a village green in Massachusetts ended across an ocean. Britain recognized the independence of the United States of America, 13 fragile states, stitched together by exhaustion, hope, and an idea. The empire had fallen, but the victory was not yet peace. The revolution had freed a nation. It had not yet defined it. Washington returned to his army's camp on the Hudson, where men still lived in tents patched with rags and dreams. The war was won, but pay was scarce, and tempers raw. Mutiny simmered. Officers spoke of marching on Congress itself. Washington rode among them, calm and grave, and reminded them what they had fought for. "We have laid the foundation of freedom," he told them. "Let us not destroy it by acts of violence." His words stilled the storm. A republic had been born just barely. In December, he did what no conqueror had ever done. He gave power back. In Annapolis, before a stunned Congress, Washington resigned his commission and bowed. "Having now finished the work assigned me," he said, "I retire from the great theatre of action." He left the room as a soldier and went home as a citizen. The gesture echoed louder than any victory. Across the Atlantic, George III reportedly said, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." The war's promise, however, was unevenly kept. Liberty had been declared universal, yet millions remained enslaved. The native nations, who had fought and died on both sides, saw their lands claimed by the new republic. Women who had carried messages, tended camps, and buried their sons were told to return to silence. The revolution had opened the door to freedom, but not yet invited everyone through it. Its ideals were pure, its reality complicated. Still, the seed had been planted. From that battered alliance of farmers and philosophers grew something no empire had yet produced, a nation founded on the notion that authority flows upward from the governed. The world watched as America stumbled, argued, and began to write its own story. The victory at Yorktown became more than a military triumph. It was a promise that free people could shape their destiny, even if imperfectly. As the sun set over the fields where the redcoats had once stacked their arms, the air was quiet again. The trenches were filled, the cannon rusting, the grass returning. History would call it the end of one empire and the beginning of another. But for those who had lived it, the soldiers, the sailors, the families who had prayed through years of fire, it was simpler. They had endured, they had won. And though the work of freedom was only beginning, the light that rose from Yorktown would never fade.